Crack of her hand against my face landed like a starting pistol. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there in my own kitchen, holding a dish towel, while my son's wife stared at me with those cold gray eyes like she was waiting to see if I'd fall down. I didn't fall down. I'm 67 years old, and I buried a wife, survived a recession, and raised a son on my own. I don't fall down easy. But I'll tell you something. That moment, the sting of it, the silence after that changed everything. Not because it hurt, because it clarified things, like fog lifting off a river. All of a sudden, I could see exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew, standing there with my face burning, that I was going to have to be smarter than I had ever been in my life. My name is Harlan. I'm 67, retired from 31 years in commercial contracting, and I live, or I used to live peacefully, in the house I built with my own hands outside of Roanoke, Virginia. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garage big enough to hold my woodworking tools, and my late wife Elaine's old Buick that I still can't bring myself to sell. Elaine passed 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 4 months. My son Nate was 19 and already starting to drift, and I spent the next several years trying to hold our little family together with nothing but routines and Sunday dinners and sheer stubbornness. Nate and I were never the kind to talk much about feelings. That's just how we were wired. But we worked side by side on weekends. We watched football. We drove up to Shenandoah every fall to see the leaves. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Then he met Celeste. I want to be fair. I want to be the kind of man who says he gave her a real chance. And I did, in the beginning. She was sharp, pretty in an angular sort of way. The kind of woman who always seemed to be calculating something behind her smile. Nate was 31. She was 28. And they moved fast. Engaged in 8 months, married in 14. I walked Nate down to the altar. His words, not mine. He said he wanted me beside him since his mother couldn't be, and I genuinely wished them well. The cracks started showing about 6 months into their marriage, right around the time they moved in with me. It was my idea, and I take responsibility for that. The housing market had gone sideways, they were paying too much for their apartment, and I had all this space. I thought it would be good for all of us. I thought wrong. Celeste had opinions about everything. The way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I kept a garage, the smell of my woodworking shop. She started making little comments, then bigger ones. She'd redirect conversations in front of company, cut me off mid-sentence, correct me on things I'd been doing for 40 years. Nate would sit there saying nothing, turning a little smaller each time, and I started to understand that my son had handed over some essential piece of himself to this woman and wasn't sure how to ask for it back. I let most of it go. You pick your battles at my age. But then came the money. Celeste had big plans. She wanted them to open a boutique, high-end gifts and home decor, she said, very on trend, and she wanted to do it in downtown Roanoke in a space that cost more per square foot than I'd paid for this entire property in 1989. She came to me with a folder, an actual folder with printouts and projections, and a pitch like she'd rehearsed it. She needed $40,000 to get started. As an investment, she said. Partners, she said. I looked at the numbers. I looked at Nate, who was staring at the table. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it. I said no. That's when the temperature in the house changed. She stopped saying good morning. She started parking in a way that blocked me from getting my truck out easily. Small cruelties, done with deniability. Nate started working longer hours. Real or manufactured, I don't know, and I found myself eating alone most evenings in a house I'd built with my own hands. Then she started in on the house itself. It began as suggestions. We should refinish the floors. We should update the kitchen. Normal enough things. But then one Sunday evening, she sat across from me at the dining room table. My dining room table, the one Elaine and I picked out at an estate sale in 1994, and she put a document in front of me. She wanted me to sign over a portion of the property. Not the whole thing, she was quick to say, just enough of a stake that they could use it as collateral for a business loan. It would be temporary, she said, just until the boutique got off the ground. You'd barely notice, she said. I looked at that document for a long time. I looked at Nate. He was looking at the wall. I said, I need to think about this. She said, there's nothing to think about. You have more house than you need, and we have an opportunity we're about to miss. I said, I've been thinking about what I need for 67 years. I'll take a few more days. Something moved across her face. She stood up. She leaned forward, and then her palm connected with the side of my face so fast I didn't register what had happened until I heard the sound. That flat, sharp crack. The dish towel in my hand. Her gray eyes waiting. Nate said, "Celeste." She said, "He's being deliberately obstructive." Nate said nothing else. I set the dish towel on the table, very carefully. I walked to my room and I closed the door and I sat on the edge of the bed that Elaine and I shared for 22 years, and I thought for a long time. I didn't call the police. I considered it. But I knew what I was going to do would be more permanent than a police report. I needed to be precise. I needed to be patient. And I needed a plan. The next morning, I drove to see my attorney, a woman named Patrice who has handled my affairs for 15 years and who does not suffer fools in any form. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate most about her. When I finished, she set down her pen. She said, "Harlan, you understand that until you sign something, they have no claim." I said, "I understand that." She said, "And you understand that as a resident of your home, eviction requires notice and process." I said, "I understand that too, but I'm not interested in a fight. I'm interested in the truth coming out in a way that can't be buried." She leaned back. She said, "Tell me what you're thinking." I told her. What I'd noticed over the months Celeste and Nate had lived with me was that Celeste had a pattern. She was meticulous about appearances, but sloppy about records. She spoke freely on the phone because she'd never once seen me pay any particular attention when she was talking. She assumed I was just a harmless old man going deaf. I am not going deaf. I'd heard things, financial things, a call to someone she called my guy about moving funds before the end of the quarter, a conversation with a friend about her mother's estate, not Nate's family money, her own mother's, and the words "before he finds out" and the account in Asheville. I hadn't thought much of it in isolation, but slap a man in his own kitchen and suddenly he starts paying much closer attention. Over the next 6 weeks, I kept my face neutral and my ears open. I said nothing about signing the property document. When Celeste pressed me, I said I was having it reviewed. She seemed satisfied by that. She turned her attention back to her phone calls and her plans. I also did something I'm not entirely proud of, but I'm not ashamed of either. I bought a small digital recorder from an electronics store on the edge of town. Virginia is a one-party consent state when it comes to recording conversations. I am always a party to conversations in my own home. What I captured over 5 weeks was, to put it plainly, illuminating. Celeste had been diverting money. Not Nate's money, exactly, but money from a joint account they shared, and money that Nate believed was going towards savings, and money from a side business she ran online that Nate didn't fully understand. She was also, as best I could piece together, planning to use the property stake she'd tried to get from me as collateral, not for any boutique, but for something she'd already half-started with her guy. A real estate scheme that involved short-term rentals in some regulatory gray areas I am not qualified to explain, but that Patrice understood immediately when I played the recordings. Patrice said, "This is more than enough." I said, "I know, but I want to do this right. I don't want it to feel like an ambush. I want it to feel like a consequence." She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled, which Patrice does rarely and only when she means it. She said, "What did you have in mind?" Here is what I had in mind. Every year for the past 12 years, I have hosted a gathering at my home the first Sunday of October. It started as a small thing. A few neighbors, my old business partner Clem and his wife, some folks from church. Over time, it had grown. Elaine had loved hosting. I kept it going in her memory. By the time all of this happened, we were typically seeing 30 or 40 people come through. Celeste had been angling to use this year's gathering as a launch event for her boutique idea. Networking, she called it. She'd invited additional guests, people from the business community, a few of her contacts, without asking me. She'd started making decisions about the menu. She'd told people, from what I gathered, that the house would soon be under new management, which I found interesting since no one had told me that. I let her plan. I helped her even. I asked what she needed, offered to call the caterer she wanted. She seemed pleased and a little suspicious, the way people are when you stop fighting them. I could see her recalibrating, deciding I had finally accepted the situation. What she didn't know was that Patrice had arranged for 2 additional guests. The first was a forensic accountant named Richard who had spent 20 years with the IRS before going private. He had reviewed everything I'd provided and prepared a summary document, clean and precise, 8 pages. The second was an attorney from Roanoke who handled financial fraud cases. His name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that he had seen the summary and he had questions for Celeste. Questions that had nothing to do with me. The gathering was a Sunday. October. The leaves on the ridge behind the house were the color of embers. I remember standing on the porch that morning, coffee in hand, watching the light come through the trees and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement. Something quieter than that. Certainty. Celeste was in full hostess mode, which meant she was managing everyone else, while Nate stood near the food table looking like a man waiting for a flight he didn't want to board. I watched my son that morning, and I felt something complicated move through my chest. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I was sad for him. He'd been managed so long, he'd forgotten how to stand up straight. People came in waves, neighbors, old friends, some of Celeste's business contacts who arrived in groups and seemed uncertain why they'd been invited to what was clearly a family gathering. I greeted everyone at the door, shook hands, poured drinks, behaved exactly as I always have in this house. Richard and the attorney arrived together, which I had asked them to do. I introduced them simply as friends, which they were gracious enough to play along with. Celeste looked at them once, briefly, and then looked away. The way you look at strangers, you don't need to categorize yet. After the meal, when people had spread out to the porch and the living room and the yard, I asked everyone if I could have their attention for a moment. I do this every year. I say a few words about Elaine, about the year, about gratitude. People settled and quieted the way they always do. I talked about Elaine first. I always do. I talked about what this house had meant to her and what it meant to me and what it meant to keep opening it to people we love. I watched Nate's jaw tighten. I watched Celeste's smile hold itself in place with visible effort. Then I said I wanted to share something. I said that over the past several months I'd learned some things that had changed my understanding of my situation. I said I didn't want anyone in that room to feel deceived because I hadn't wanted to deceive anyone myself. I looked at Celeste when I said that. She looked back at me. The smile was still there, but her eyes had gone very still. I introduced Richard. I said he had reviewed some financial documents relevant to our household and would like to share some findings. Richard stood up. He's a small, quiet man with reading glasses and a way of speaking that makes everything sound reasonable, and he summarized in about 10 minutes what he had found. He used the word diversion. He used the phrase undisclosed account. He did not raise his voice once. The room was very quiet. Celeste said, "This is completely inappropriate." Her voice was steady. "I'll give her that." The attorney said very calmly that he had some questions about the Asheville account and that she was welcome to discuss them privately or not, but that certain parties were going to be asking them either way, and it might be to her benefit to get ahead of it. Celeste looked at Nate. Nate looked at me. I looked at my son for a long moment. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I was just his father, looking at him the way fathers do when they want their children to understand something without having to say it. He looked back at Celeste. He said quietly but clearly, "How much?" She didn't answer. He said it again. "Celeste, how much?" The room stayed quiet. 30-some people who had come for a Sunday gathering and found themselves inside a moment they would talk about for years. I won't tell you exactly what happened after that because some of it is still being worked through legally, and Patrice has advised me not to get into specifics. What I will tell you is that Celeste left that afternoon without finishing her coffee. That Nate stayed. That we sat on the porch until almost midnight. The two of us, the way we used to sit after football games when he was young. Not saying much, but saying enough. He told me he'd known something was wrong for almost a year. He told me he'd convinced himself it wasn't as bad as he suspected, which is what people do when they're not ready to see clearly. He told me he was sorry, and he said it like he meant it, which he did, because Nate has never been good at faking sincerity. That's one thing I can say for certain about my son. Whatever else happened, whatever else Celeste wore down in him, that part survived. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. I told him this was still his home whenever he needed it. I told him what I'd told myself that first night, standing in my room with the sting still in my face, that clarity, even when it costs you, is always worth more than comfortable blindness. He's been staying in his old room for 6 weeks now. We've been working on the back deck together on weekends, a project I've been putting off for 2 years. We don't talk about Celeste much. When we do, It's in small doses, things he's still processing. I don't push. I just hand him the next board and let him work. The boutique never opened, of course. The Asheville account is the subject of an ongoing proceeding that I understand may also involve her guy and a few other parties. I am not involved in that directly. I provided what I had to Patrice and let the appropriate people take it from there. That's how it should work. You gather the truth carefully, you place it where it belongs, and then you let the system do what it's built to do. I have been asked a few times since if I felt bad about the way that Sunday went, about having witnesses there, about doing it publicly. I think about that. The honest answer is no. I thought about doing it privately, just Nate and Celeste and the attorneys in a room. But I understood, having watched Celeste operate for 2 years, that private confrontations were her element. She was extraordinary at managing one-on-one. She could redirect, reframe, make you doubt what you'd seen with your own eyes. What she wasn't prepared for was an audience that already knew her version of events wasn't the only one. That wasn't cruelty. That was accuracy. I am 67 years old. I have outlasted a recession and a bankruptcy scare in 1997 and the death of the woman who made me want to be a better man, and 31 years of job sites where people tried to cut corners on my watch. I've learned that dignity is not a feeling, it's a practice. You choose it deliberately, over and over, especially when everything in you wants to do something loud and immediate and satisfying. The morning after that Sunday, I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the deer come through the yard the way they do this time of year, moving slow and quiet through the mist off the ridge. Nate came out about an hour later, sleek-creased, and sat down in the other chair. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. The deer moved through and disappeared into the trees. After a while, he said, "You want breakfast?" I said, "I'll cook." And I did. Eggs and toast and the good coffee I don't usually bother with on weekdays. We sat at the same table where she put that document in front of me, and we ate together in the quiet of an October morning, and for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, I felt like myself again. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just myself, in my own house and my own table with my son across from me eating eggs. That's what justice actually feels like, I think. Not the crack of a gavel, not the look on someone's face when they realize the game is over. Just the ordinary morning that comes after. The coffee and the deer and the kid you raised sitting across from you, whole enough to share a meal, that's what I was after, the whole time. I just had to clear the table first. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn over a piece of wood before you cut it, looking for the grain, figuring out which way it wants to go. What happened to me wasn't unusual. I know that now. Across this country, there are people sitting in houses they built or paid for or bled for, being slowly edged out by someone who decided that patience and decency were the same thing as weakness. And maybe that's the first thing worth saying. They are not the same thing. Not even close. Celeste counted on my silence being surrender. That's where she miscalculated. I stayed quiet because I was thinking, because I've lived long enough to know that a reaction delivered in anger is just another thing you'll have to clean up later. What she read as an old man going soft was actually an old man getting precise. That's what I mean when I say intelligence matters in these situations. Not cleverness, not schemes, just the willingness to slow down, observe, and refuse to act until you understand what you're actually dealing with. Celeste moved fast her whole life. That was her edge and her blind spot both. She never stopped long enough to consider that someone quieter than her might be watching more carefully. The truth has a weight to it. I've noticed this over 67 years. You can move it around, repackage it, delay it, but it doesn't disappear. What Celeste was doing with that money, with Nate, with my home, none of it could have stayed hidden forever. All I did was choose the moment when it came to light and choose it deliberately, with enough witnesses that it couldn't be undone or respun. That's what I'd call moral courage, though I wouldn't have used those words at the time. I just knew what was right. I knew what Elaine would have expected of me. Not rage, not retaliation for its own sake, but accountability, clean and clear, placed where it could actually do something. And Nate. I think about my son a lot these days. He made choices I didn't understand for a long time, but I've come to believe that living inside someone else's version of reality for long enough makes it genuinely hard to see your way out. He wasn't weak. He was lost. There's a difference. And it matters, because lost people can find their way back. Wheat people are a different conversation. He found his way back. 6 weeks of shared meals and deck boards and not much talking, and I can see him coming back to himself. That's what I was working toward the whole time, if I'm honest. Not the exposure of Celeste, not the satisfaction of that Sunday afternoon, but this, my son across the table, present, real, ours again. I don't think about what I lost during those 2 years very much anymore. I think about what held. The house held. The friendships held. My own sense of who I am held, even on the nights it felt like it was slipping. That's the thing about integrity. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up in the morning, making the coffee, watching the deer come through the yard. It outlasts almost everything else if you let it. I let it. And that turned out to be enough.